go into the book. To prepare for the inevitable war with China, Japan had spent decades training its men for combat. The molding of young men to serve in the Japanese military began early in life, and in the 1930s, the martial influence seeped into every aspect of Japanese boyhood. Toy shops became virtual shrines to war, selling arsenals of toy soldiers, tanks, helmets, uniforms, rifles, anti-aircraft guns, bugles, and howitzers. Memoirs from that time describe pre-adolescent boys waging mock battles in the streets using bamboo poles as imaginary rifles. Some even tied logs of wood on their back and fantasized about dying as human bomb heroes in suicide missions. Now, I can tell you, I grew up doing all that stuff. We played war all the time. All the time. So I don't find anything shocking about that. Back to the book. Japanese schools operated like miniature military units. Indeed, some of the teachers were military officers who lectured students on their duty to help Japan fulfill its divine destiny of conquering Asia and being able to stand up to the world's nations as a people second to none. Now we're starting to get off course. They taught young boys how to handle wooden models of guns and older boys how to handle real ones. Textbooks became vehicles for military propaganda. One geography book even used the shape of Japan as justification for expansion. We appear to be standing in the vanguard of Asia, advancing bravely into the Pacific. At the same time, we appear ready to defend the Asian continent from outside attack. Teachers also instilled in boys hatred and contempt for the Chinese people, preparing them psychologically for a future invasion of the Chinese mainland. One historian tells the story of a squeamish Japanese schoolboy in the 1930s who burst into tears when told to dissect a frog. His teacher slammed his knuckles against the boy's head and yelled, "Why are you crying about one lousy frog? When you grow up, you'll have to kill 100, 200 chinks." Japanese Minister of Education declared that schools were run not for the benefit of the students, but for the good of the country. Elementary school teachers were trained like military recruits, with student teachers housed in barracks and subject to harsh discipline and indoctrination. In 1890, the Imperial Rescript on Education emerged. It laid down a code of ethics to govern not only students and teachers, but every Japanese citizen. The Rescript was the civilian equivalent of Japanese military codes, which valued above all obedience to authority and unconditional loyalty to the emperor. In every Japanese school, a copy of the Rescript was enshrined with a portrait of the emperor and taken out each morning to be read. It was reputed that more than one teacher who accidentally stumbled over the words committed suicide to atone for the insult to the sacred document. So we've got that's 1890, by the way, 1890. So this is generations now that this is being plugged into to the students' brains. And these things, you know, when we talk about students, we talk about children, we teach them generally freedom is the ultimate goal. Freedom is the ultimate thing to strive for. The ultimate thing to defend is freedom. And here they're getting taught that the ultimate thing was obedience to authority and unconditional loyalty. Back to the book. It was commonplace for teachers to behave like sadistic drill sergeants, slapping children across the cheeks, hitting them with their fists, or bludgeoning them with bamboo or wooden swords. Students were forced to hold heavy objects, sit on their knees, stand barefoot in the snow, or run around the playground until they collapsed from exhaustion. There were certainly few visits to the schools by indignant or even concerned parents. The pressure to conform to authority intensified if the schoolboy decided to become a soldier. Vicious hazing and a relentless pecking order usually squelched any residual spirit of individualism within him. Obedience was touted as a supreme virtue, and a sense of individual self-worth was replaced by a sense of value as a small cog in the larger scheme of things. To establish this sublimation of individuality to the common good, superior officers of older soldiers slapped recruits for almost no reason at all or beat them severely with heavy wooden rods. According to the author Toshio, officers often justified unauthorized punishment, saying, "I do not beat you because I hate you. I beat you because I care for you. Do you think I perform these acts with hands swollen and bloody in a state of madness?" Some youths died under such brutal physical conditions. Others committed suicide. The majority became tempered vessels into which the military could pour a new set of life goals. So this is complete, militant raising of children. And what I want to note here is anybody that thinks, that probably produced some incredible warriors. You're actually wrong. Did it produce warriors? Yes, it did. But let's remember that these warriors that were raised in this manner, when they had American soldiers and Marines that had to face them when they were in incredibly well dug in defensive positions, and the Americans had to take beachfronts and beachheads, the free-thinking American soldier proved to be the better. Back to the book. Training was no less grueling a process for aspiring officers. Above all, the Japanese cadets were to adopt a will which knows no defeat. So terrified were the cadets of any hint of failure that examination results were kept secret to minimize the risk of suicide. So that's what, again, this was going all the way back to 1890. So we've got 40, 50 years worth before we get into this, where this massacre takes place. Back to the book. In the summer of 1937, Japan finally succeeded in provoking a full-scale war with China. So Japan was now engaged in a war with China. They went to Shanghai. The Japanese invaded Shanghai, big giant city, and they thought they were going to have no factor, right? Because they're getting told all the time that they're the best and they're the supreme warriors and all this. Well, going back to the book here, Japanese military leaders had boasted and seriously believed that Japan could conquer all of mainland China within 3 months. We got some arrogance going on here. But when a battle in a single Chinese city alone, that was Shanghai, dragged from summer to fall and then from fall to winter, it shattered Japanese fantasies of an easy victory. Here, this primitive people, illiterate in military science and poorly trained, had managed to fight the superior Japanese to a standstill. When Shanghai finally fell in November, the mood of the imperial troops had turned ugly. And many, it was said, lusted for revenge as they marched towards Nanking. So they're en route now. They had a hard time taking down Shanghai. They got vengeance on their mind when they're going into the city of Nanking. Back to the book. Little was spared on the path to Nanking. Japanese veterans remember raiding tiny farm communities where they clubbed or bayoneted everyone in sight. But small villages were not the only casualties. Entire cities were razed to the ground. Consider the example of Suzhou, a city on the east bank of Taihu Lake. One of the oldest cities in China, it was prized for its delicate silk embroidery palaces and temples. Its canals and ancient bridges had earned the city its Western nickname as the Venice of China. On November 19th, on a morning of pouring rain, a Japanese advance guard marched through the gates of Suzhou wearing hoods that prevented the Chinese sentries from recognizing them. Once inside, the Japanese murdered and plundered the city for days, burning down ancient landmarks and abducting thousands of Chinese women for sexual slavery. The invasion, according to the China Weekly Review, caused the population of the city to drop from 350,000 to less than 500. But the worst was still to come. Now, there was a general that was sort of in charge of the Japanese that were heading to Nanking. His name was General Matsui, and he seemed to have some semblance of honor to him and gave some pretty good, I would say, benevolent type, as benevolent as you can be when you're going into war, of orders. So here's one of the things that he proclaimed. Back to the book. The entry of the Imperial Army into a foreign capital is a great event in our history, attracting the attention of the world. Therefore, let no unit enter the city in a disorderly fashion. Let them know beforehand the matters to be remembered and the position of foreign rights and interests in the walled city. Let them be absolutely free from plunder. He's given some pretty, like I said, about as benevolent orders as you could give. That was Matsui. Well, unfortunately, Matsui gets sick, and he can't be the leader. Although he kind of goes in and out of a leadership position as this is going on. There's a new guy that comes in, and the new guy that comes in is actual royalty, named Prince Asaka. Now, Prince Asaka gets word. He starts to get to understand the situation that they're going into, and he gets told that, yeah, they're going to be, when they take Nanking, they're going to have about 300,000 Chinese troops to deal with. And they get some preliminary word that it sounds like the Chinese are ready to surrender. They kind of hear that intelligence. They have spies in there and whatnot. Back to the book. After Asaka heard this report, it was said that his headquarters sent out a set of orders under his personal seal marked secret to be destroyed. We now know that the message of these orders was clear. Kill all captives. And they actually do have a copy of an order that came out. And this was on December 13th, 1937. The Japanese 66th Battalion received the following command. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but here's parts of it. Battalion battle reporter at 200 received order from the regiment commander to comply with orders from the brigade commanding headquarters. All prisoners of war are to be executed. Method of execution: divide the prisoners into group of a dozen, shoot to kill separately. Goes on to give some details about who's supposed to run this, and then it continues. Back to the book. The vicinity of the imprisonment must be heavily guarded. Our intentions are absolutely not to be detected by the prisoners. Every company is to complete preparation before 0500. Executions are to start promptly by that time, and action is to be finished by 7:30. So there you go. Straight up orders. They're going to kill everyone. And it's very important to note here that he says our intentions are absolutely not to be detected. So they were going to make it very clandestine and keep the Chinese from knowing that they were going to kill them all. Back to the book. There was a ruthless logic to the order. The captives could not be fed, so they had to be destroyed. Killing them would not only eliminate the food problem, but diminish the possibility of retaliation. Moreover, dead enemies could not form up into guerrilla forces. So they have their orders. They go in and they begin the operation. And here we go. Back to the book. All this was easier to achieve than the Japanese had anticipated. Resistance was sporadic. Indeed, it was practically non-existent. Having thrown away their arms when attempting to flee the city, as the Japanese closed in, many Chinese soldiers simply turned themselves in, hoping for better treatment. Once the men surrendered and permitted their hands to be bound, the rest was easy. So the Chinese give up their weapons and allow themselves to be taken. Not a good idea. Now we're going to go to a quote from a Japanese soldier named Azuma. It was funny yet pitiable when I imagined how they gathered whatever white cloth they could find, attached it to a dead twig, and marched forward just to surrender. I thought, how could they become prisoners with the kind of force that they had? More than 2 battalions, and even without trying to show any resistance. There must have been a considerable number of officers for this many troops, but not a single one remained. All of them having slipped away and escaped, I thought. Although we had 2 companies, and those 7,000 prisoners had already been disarmed, our troops could have been annihilated had they decided to rise up and revolt. And I didn't go through too much of this, but it was a chaotic scene when the Chinese realized what was going to happen. And as that indicated, a lot of the senior leadership, they fled the city. And so it left these soldiers there now with no leadership. And what are they going to do? And, the Japanese did psychological warfare on them and dropped leaflets that said, hey, if you surrender, you'll be treated well. We have rice for you. And that's what they did. They lied, of course. Back to the book. When the Japanese military received orders on December 17th to kill prisoners, they proceeded with extra caution. That morning, the Japanese announced that they were going to transport the Chinese prisoners to a small island in the middle of the Yangtze River. They explained to the captives that they needed to take special precautions to move and bound the captives' hands behind their backs, a task that took all morning and most of the afternoon. Sometime between 4 and 6 p.m., the Japanese divided the prisoners into 4 columns and marched them to the west, skirting the hills and stopping at the riverbank. After 3 or 4 hours of waiting and not knowing what was going on, the prisoners could not see any preparations for crossing the river. The corporal wrote, "It was going dark. They did not know that Japanese soldiers already encircled them in a crescent formation along the river and that they were in sights of many machine guns. By the time the executions began, it was too late for the Chinese to escape. Suddenly, all kinds of guns fired at once. Kuriha, Ricci wrote. The sound of the firearms mingled with the desperate yelling and screams. For an hour, the Chinese struggled and thrashed about desperately until there were few sounds coming from the group. From evening until dawn, the Japanese bayoneted the bodies one by one." And that scene took place over and over and over again, because what they did is they indicated in that order, if you missed it, they separated the groups. So they had them captured inside the city, and then they took them in small units of 30, 40 Chinese soldiers, tied their hands and said, yep, we're going to transport you. And they did this all over the city at the same time, coordinated, and then took them out to different places outside the city and killed them. But it wasn't only the soldiers that they did this to. Back to the book. After the soldiers surrendered en masse, there was virtually no one left to protect the citizens of the city. Knowing this, the Japanese poured into Nanking on December 13th, 1937, occupying government buildings, banks, and warehouses, shooting people randomly in the streets, many of them in the back as they ran away. Using machine guns, revolvers, and rifles, the Japanese fired at the crowds of wounded soldiers, elderly women, and children who gathered in the north and central roads and nearby alleys. They also killed Chinese civilians in every section of the city. Tiny lanes, major boulevards, mud dugouts, government buildings, city squares. As victims toppled to the ground, moaning and screaming, the streets, alleys, and ditches of the fallen capital ran rivers of blood, much of it coming from people barely alive with no strength left to run away. The Japanese systematically killed the city dwellers as they conducted house-to-house searches for Chinese soldiers in Nanking. But they also massacred the Chinese in nearby suburbs and countryside. Corpses piled up outside the city walls, along the river, by ponds and lakes, and on hills and mountains. In villages near Nanking, the Japanese shot down any young man who passed under the presumption that he was likely to be a former Chinese soldier. But they also murdered people who could not possibly be Chinese soldiers, elderly men and women, for instance, if they hesitated or even if they failed to understand orders, which were delivered in Japanese language. And obviously, not every Chinese person spoke Japanese. So this is now just a full-on killing spree. And I'm going to read a section here. There was military war correspondents that were there from the Japanese military. And I will read, this one is from a military war correspondent named Yukio Omata. And he saw the Chinese prisoners being brought and lined up along the river. Back to the book. Those in the first row were beheaded. Those in the second row were forced to dump the severed bodies into the river before they themselves were beheaded. The killing went on nonstop from morning until night, but they were only able to kill 2,000 persons in this way. The next day, tired of killing in this fashion, they set up machine guns. 2 of them raked a crossfire at the lined-up prisoners. Rat-tat-tat-tat. Triggers were pulled. The prisoners fled into the water, but no one was able to make it to the other shore. Systematic murder of everyone is basically what we're dealing with. And when they got their momentum going on the extermination of most of the men, they turned their attention to the women. Back to the book. Women suffered the most. Takakoro Kozu, a former soldier in the 114th Division of the Japanese Army in Nanking, recalled. No matter how young or old, they all could not escape the fate of being raped. We sent out coal trucks to the city streets and villages to seize a lot of women. And then each of them was allocated to 15 to 20 soldiers for sexual intercourse and abuse. Surviving Japanese veterans claim that the army had officially outlawed rape of enemy women. But rape remained so deeply embedded in Japanese military culture and superstition that no one took the rule seriously. Many believed that raping virgins would make them more powerful in battle. Soldiers were even known to wear amulets made from the pubic hair of such victims, believing that they possessed magical powers against injury. The military policy forbidding rape only encouraged soldiers to kill their victims afterwards. During an interview for the documentary In the Name of the Emperor, Azuma Shiro, a former Japanese soldier, spoke candidly about the process of rape and murder in Nanking. We took turns raping them. It would be all right if we only raped them. I shouldn't say all right, but we always stabbed and killed them because dead bodies don't talk. Takakoro Kozo shared Azuma's bluntness in discussing the issue. After raping, we would also kill them, he recalled. These women would start to flee once we let them go. Then we would bang, shoot them in the back, and finish them up. According to surviving veterans, many of the soldiers felt remarkably little guilt about this. Perhaps when we were raping her, we looked at her as a woman, Azuma wrote. But when we killed her, we just thought of her as something like a pig. So, where is this mindset comes from that permits this kind of behavior? I'm going to the book. The Japanese soldier was not simply hardened for battle in China. He was hardened for the task of murdering Chinese combatants and non-combatants alike. Indeed, various games and exercises were set up by the Japanese military to numb its men to the human instinct against killing people who are not attacking. For example, on the way to the capital, Japanese soldiers were made to participate in killing competitions, which were avidly covered by the Japanese media like sporting events. The most notorious one appeared in the December 7th issue of the Japan Advisor under the headline, "Sub-Lieutenants Race to Fell 100 Chinese Running Close Contest." Sub-Lieutenant Mukai Toshiaki and Sub-Lieutenant Noda Takeshi, they were in a friendly contest to see which one of them will first fell 100 Chinese individual sword combat before the Japanese forces completely occupy Nanking. They're well in the final phase of their race, running almost neck to neck. On Sunday, December 5th, the score, according to Asahi, was Sub-Lieutenant Mukai, 89, and Sub-Lieutenant Noda, 78. And just to give some more context on this, these were just lining people up and chopping their heads off. That's what this was. Just lining up civilians, and let's see who can get to 150 or 100 first. Back to the book. A week later, the paper reported that neither man could decide who had passed the 100 mark first, so they upped the goal to 150. Makai's blade was slightly damaged in the competition, the Japan Advisor reported. He explained that this was the result of cutting a Chinese in half, helmet and all. The contest was fun, he declared. Another Japanese soldier talking about his experience. Tominaga Shozo wrote, "We made them like this. Good sons, good daddies, good elder brothers at home were brought to the front to kill each other. Human beings turned into murdering demons. Everyone became a demon within 3 months." In interview after interview, Japanese veterans from the Nanking massacre reported honestly that they experienced a complete lack of remorse or sense of wrongdoing even when torturing helpless civilians. Nagatomi Hakudo spoke candidly about his emotions in the fallen capital. Quote, "I remember being driven in a truck along a path that had been cleared through piles of thousands and thousands of slaughtered bodies. Wild dogs were gnawing at the dead flesh as we stopped and pulled a group of Chinese prisoners out of the back. Then the Japanese officer proposed a test of my courage. He unsheathed his sword, spat on it, and with a sudden mighty swing, he brought it down on the neck of a Chinese boy cowering before us. The head was cut clean off and tumbled away on the group as the body slumped forward, blood spurting out in 2 great gushing fountains from the neck. The officer suggested I take the head home as a souvenir. I remember smiling proudly as I took his sword and began killing people. Few know that soldiers impaled babies on bayonets and tossed them still alive into pots of boiling water. They gang raped women from ages of 12 to 80 and then killed them when they could no longer satisfy sexual requirements. I beheaded people, starved them to death, burned them, and buried them alive, over 200 in all. It is terrible that I could turn into an animal and do these things. There are really no words to explain what I was doing. I was truly a devil. Beyond those situations, torture was also completely common. And here's what the book says. The torture that the Japanese inflicted upon the native population at Nanking almost surpasses the limits of human comprehension. Here are only a few examples. Live burials. The Japanese directed burial operations with the precision and efficiency of an assembly line. Soldiers would force one group of Chinese captives to dig a grave, a second group to bury the first, and then a third group to bury the second, and so on. Some victims were partially buried to their chest or necks so that they would endure further agony, such as being hacked to pieces by swords or run over by horses and tanks. Mutilation. The Japanese not only disemboweled, decapitated, and dismembered victims, but performed more excruciating varieties of torture. Throughout the city, they nailed prisoners to wooden boards and ran over them with tanks, crucified them to trees and electrical posts, carved long strips of flesh from them, and used them for bayonet practice. At least 100 men reportedly had their eyes gouged out and their noses and ears hacked off before being set on fire. Another group of 200 Chinese soldiers and civilians were stripped naked, tied to columns and doors of a school, and then stabbed by special needles with handles on them in hundreds of points along their bodies, including their mouths, throats, and eyes. Death by fire. The Japanese subjected large crowds of victims to mass incineration. A Japanese soldier bound Chinese captives together 10 at a time and pushed them into a pit where they were sprayed with gasoline and ignited. On Taiping Road, the Japanese ordered a large number of shop clerks to extinguish a fire, then bound them together with rope and threw them into the blaze. Japanese soldiers even devised games with fire. One method of entertainment was to drive mobs of Chinese to the top stories or roofs of buildings, tear down the stairs, and then set the bottom floors on fire. Many such victims committed suicide by jumping out of windows or off rooftops. Another form of amusement involved dousing victims in fuel, shooting them, and watching them explode into flame. In one infamous incident, Japanese soldiers forced hundreds of men, women, and children into a square, soaked them with gasoline, and then fired on them with machine guns. Death by ice. Thousands of victims were intentionally frozen to death during the rape of Nanking. For instance, Japanese soldiers forced hundreds of Chinese prisoners to march to the edge of a frozen pond where they were ordered to strip naked, break the ice, and plunge into the water to go fishing. Their bodies hardened into floating targets that were immediately riddled with Japanese bullets. In another incident, the Japanese tied up a group of refugees, flung them into a shallow pond, and bombarded them with hand grenades, causing an explosive shower of blood and flesh. Death by dogs. One diabolical means of torture was to bury victims to their waist and watch them get ripped apart by German shepherds. Witnesses saw Japanese soldiers strip a victim naked and direct German shepherds to bite sensitive areas of his body. The dogs not only ripped open his belly, but jerked out his intestines along the ground for a distance. The incidents mentioned above are only a fraction of the methods that the Japanese used to torment their victims. The Japanese saturated victims in acid, impaled babies with bayonets, hung people by their tongues. One Japanese reporter who later investigated the rape of Nanking learned that at least one Japanese soldier tore the heart and liver out of a Chinese victim to eat them. Even genitals apparently were consumed. A Chinese soldier who escaped from Japanese custody saw several dead people in the streets with their penises cut off. He was later told that the penises were sold to Japanese customers who believed that eating them would increase fertility. With regards to the fate of the women, they don't know how to determine the exact number of the women that were raped in Nanking. But they do know that it was almost universal. Back to the book. The Japanese raped Nanking women from all classes: farm wives, students, teachers, white-collar and blue-collar workers, wives of YMCA employees, university professors, even Buddhist nuns, some of whom were gang raped to death. And they were systematic in their recruitment of women. In Nanking, Japanese soldiers searched for them constantly as they looted homes and dragged men off for execution. Some actually conducted door-to-door searches, demanding money and young girls. Chinese women were raped in all locations and at all hours. An estimated 1/3 of all rapes occurred during the day. Survivors even remember soldiers prying open the legs of victims to rape them in broad daylight in the middle of the street and in front of crowds of witnesses. No place was too sacred for rape. The Japanese attacked women in nunneries, churches, and Bible training schools. 17 soldiers raped one woman in succession in a seminary compound. Old age was no concern to the Japanese. Matrons, grandmothers, and great-grandmothers endured repeated sexual assaults. A Japanese soldier who raped a woman of 60 was ordered to clean the penis by her mouth. When a woman of 62 protested to soldiers that she was too old for sex, they rammed a stick up inside her instead. Many women in their 80s were raped to death, and at least one woman in that age group was shot and killed because she refused a Japanese soldier's advances. If the Japanese treatment of old women was terrible, their treatment of young children was unthinkable. Little girls were raped so brutally that some could not walk for weeks afterwards. Many required surgery, others died. Chinese witnesses saw Japanese rape girls under 10 years of age in the streets and then slash them in half by sword. In some cases, the Japanese sliced open the vaginas of preteen girls in order to ravish them more effectively. Even in advanced stages of pregnancy, did not render women immune to assault. The Japanese violated many who were about to go into labor, were in labor, or who had given birth only a few days earlier. One victim, who was 9 months pregnant, was raped, suffered not only stillbirth but a complete mental collapse. At least one pregnant woman was kicked to death. Still more gruesome was the treatment allotted to some of the unborn children of these women. After gang rape, Japanese soldiers sometimes slashed open the bellies of pregnant women and ripped out the fetuses for amusement. During the mass rape, the Japanese destroyed children and infants, often because they were in the way. Eyewitnesses describe children and babies suffocating from clothes stuffed in their mouths or bayoneted to death because they wept as their mothers were being raped. American and European observers of the rape of Nanking recorded numerous entries like this one. February 3rd, about 5 p.m. at Changshu-Zhang, 3 soldiers came and forced a woman to throw away her baby. After raping her, they went away laughing. Perhaps one of the most brutal forms of Japanese entertainment was the impalement of vaginas. In the streets of Nanking, corpses of women lay with their legs splayed open, their orifice pierced by wooden rods, twigs, and weeds. It is painful, almost mind-numbing, to contemplate some of the other objects that were used to torment the Nanking women, who suffered almost unendurable ordeals. For instance, one Japanese soldier who raped a young woman thrust a beer bottle into her and shot her. Another rape victim was found with a golf stick rammed into her. And on December 22nd, in a neighborhood near the gate of Tongjin, the Japanese raped a barber's wife and then stuck a firecracker in her vagina. It blew up and killed her. Not all the victims were women. Chinese men were often sodomized or forced to perform a variety of repulsive sexual acts in front of laughing Chinese soldiers or Japanese soldiers. At least one Chinese man was murdered because he refused to commit necrophilia with the corpse of a woman in the snow. The Japanese also delighted in trying to coerce men who had taken lifetime vows of celibacy to engage in sexual intercourse. A Chinese woman had tried to disguise herself as a man, try and pass through the gates of Nanking, but Japanese guards who systematically searched all passing pedestrians by groping at their crotches discovered her true sex. Gang rape followed, at which time a Buddhist monk had the misfortune to venture near the scene. The Japanese tried to force him to have sex with a woman they had just raped. When the monk protested, they castrated him, causing the poor man to bleed to death. Some of the most sordid instances of sexual torture involved the degradation of entire families. The Japanese drew sadistic pleasure in forcing Chinese men to commit incest, fathers to rape their own daughters, brothers their sisters, sons their mothers. A Chinese battalion commander stranded in Nanking for 3 months after the city fell saw or heard of at least 4 or 5 instances in which the Japanese ordered sons to rape their mothers. Those who refused were killed on the spot. His report is substantiated by the testimony of a German diplomat who reported that one Chinese man who refused to rape his own mother was killed with saber strokes and that his mother committed suicide shortly thereafter. Those who defied the Japanese were often found later with their eyes torn out, their noses, ears, and breasts cut off. As I said, this is pure evil. And I don't know what else to say. Now, I'm going to the book here. It's hard to talk about a bright spot in the horror that is the rape of Nanking, but if one can, it is surely to shine a light on the actions of a small band of Americans and Europeans who risked their lives to defy the Japanese invaders and rescue hundreds of thousands of Chinese refugees from almost certain extermination. The courageous men and women created the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone. So this is, amongst obviously this just most sadistic and heinous evil, there were some Americans and some Europeans that lived and worked in Nanking. And you got to remember, this is 1937, so it wasn't a world war yet. There was Germans there in Nanking, there was Americans there in Nanking, and when this started to happen, there was several of them who basically formed an area which said, hey, this is a safe zone. And one of them, interestingly, was a German and was a Nazi. So there's a Nazi who they ended up calling the living Buddha of Nanking. And so this individual, John Rabe, he risked his life to set up this safety zone. And actually, he was like I said, he was a Nazi, but he had spent so much time in Nanking that he had all these Chinese friends. And according to the background on him, he's been there for many years. And I don't know what year he got there, but he's not familiar with what's going on with the actual Nazi party back in Germany. He's disconnected. I mean, there's, this is whatever. There's no internet. He's not watching TV. He doesn't know what's going on. So he was just sort of there. And, the prominent party in Germany is the Nazi party. And I'm a diplomat, so I guess I'm a Nazi. But when he sounded like he was a guy that was a benevolent guy. He actually went out into town and literally stopped rapes from happening himself. And what's interesting is, and this to me set up that you could see what they thought of the Chinese people, is that all he would do is go out and be like, stop. And he had the Nazi armband or whatever. He had the swastika. And when they saw that, they would listen to him. And so, I mean, he was a white guy, and they clearly listened to him and were kind of afraid of him. And yet, obviously they had less than zero respect for the Chinese people. And so he actually wrote a letter as well to Hitler explaining what was going on. And, there's no one knows if Hitler actually ever read it. It sounds like he read it and ignored it. But one of the most interesting and important pieces of what John Rabe did is he kept a journal, a detailed journal of what had happened. So a lot of the stuff that I just quoted, which I know is horrible, he was the guy. He's one of the people that wrote it down and made sure that it was going to be recorded. And actually, that diary didn't get really discovered and uncovered until much later. Until really, Iris Chang is the one that sort of popularized and took this journal and made it into a real document that explained what had happened there. So that's, again, this John Rabe, let's even in all that darkness, there was people that stepped up and spoke against it. Another one was a guy named by the name of Robert Wilson, and he actually grew up in Nanking, and he was a Methodist missionary. But he had then left Nanking and gone back to America. He went to Princeton, and then he went to Harvard Medical School. And when he got done with all of his schooling, instead of staying in America, he went back to Nanking to become a surgeon in Nanking. And him, along with John Rabe, these were the guys that went out and set up this protective zone and did all kinds of, it's sort of like a Schindler's List scenario. No, they were helping soldiers get rid of their papers and give them clothes so they didn't look like Chinese soldiers. It's sheltering women, setting up places where the women could hide in the attics of the buildings. That's what they were doing. And it's the only thing I guess it's not different, but it's different in the fact that they could get away with it because we weren't at war with the Japanese. And so this guy Wilson was a surgeon. So not only was he trying to protect people, he was doing surgery on them all the time, trying to save them from these devastating wounds that they had. He also kept a really detailed diary, which again, these and this is part of the whole kind of genesis of this book is that, and I'll get to this later, but you've heard of like Holocaust deniers. Oh, the Holocaust didn't happen. Well, it's the same thing with this event. People say, oh, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that big of a deal. That there was some killing. So there was people that said that, some Japanese nationalists that said, oh, it wasn't really that bad. It was provoked or whatever they're going to say. And these documents, these documents that corroborated all this information were truly important. Going back to the book here, one of the worst scenes Wilson saw in Nanking, a scene he would remember for the rest of his life, a massive gang rape of teenage girls in the street. A group of young women between the ages of 15 and 18 were lined up by Japanese and then raped in the dirt, one after the other, by an entire regiment. Some hemorrhaged and died, while others killed themselves shortly afterwards. But the scenes in the hospitals were even more horrifying than those in the streets. Wilson was mortified by the women who came to the emergency room with their bellies ripped open, by the charred and horribly disfigured men whom the Japanese tried to burn alive, and by numerous other horrors he had barely had time to describe on paper. He told his wife that he would never forget a woman whose head was nearly cut off, teetering from a point on her neck. The morning came, this morning, and this is quote, this morning another woman came in a sad plight and with a terrible story. A hospital volunteer wrote of this woman in his diary in January 3rd, 1938. She was one of the 5 women whom the Japanese soldier had taken to one of their medical units to wash their clothes by day and be raped by night. The two of them were forced to satisfy from 15 to 20 men, and the prettiest one as much as 40 each night. This one who came to us had been called off by 3 soldiers into an isolated place where they attempted to cut off her head. The muscles of the neck had been cut, but they failed to sever the spinal cord. She feigned death but dragged herself to the hospital, another of the many to bear witness to the brutality of the soldiers. So Wilson just saw complete horrors. Then back to the book, he operated for free because few patients had money to pay him, but the surgeries exacted a terrible price on his own health. In the end, his family believes that only his faith as a devout Methodist combined with his love for China gave him the courage to survive the rape of Nanking. Another one of these Europeans, in this case American, a Westerner I should say, was Wilhelmina Votrin, or Minnie Votrin as they called her, as by occupation head of the education department, dean of studies at Ginling Women's Arts and Science College, was one of the few Western women in the city during the first few weeks of the Nanking massacre. Years later, she would be remembered not only for her courage in protecting thousands of women from Japanese soldiers, but also for the diary she kept. A diary that some historians believe will eventually be recognized, much like the diary of Anne Frank, for its importance in illuminating the spirit of a single witness during the Holocaust of war. Vautrin, the daughter of a blacksmith, was 51 years old in 1937, raised in the tiny farming community of Secor, Illinois. She went to live with neighbors when her mother died. Despite the impoverishment of her childhood, she was able to work her way through school, graduating with honors in 1912 from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So, just again, a Westerner, in this case an American. And she had the opportunity to maybe escape, but she stayed in Nanking. Back to the book. With most of the faculty gone from Nanking, most had abandoned their homes to flee to cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Sichuan. Vautrin was now the acting head of the institution. She labored to prepare for the campus for female refugees and to evacuate wounded soldiers from the area. To disguise their identities, she burned their military papers and garments in the college incinerator. Under her direction, furniture was moved into attics, safes were emptied, dorms were cleaned, and valuables were wrapped in oil paper and hidden. Meanwhile, posters, signs, and armbands for the Nanking Safety Zone were created and distributed among the volunteers. Here's talking about a specific day. The following day, December 17th, 1937, was even worse. The migration of women into Gingling only intensified as the Japanese soldiers flooded the city. What a heartbreaking sight, Vautrin wrote. Weary women, frightened girls trudging with children and bedding and small packages of clothes. If only someone had time to write the story of each refugee who came in, she thought, especially the stories of the girls who had blackened their faces and cut their hair. As she accommodated the stream of wild-eyed women, she heard stories of Japanese raping girls as young as 12 and women as elderly as 60, or raping pregnant women at bayonet point.